I wanted to start by talking about the very end of my tour in Jerusalem. It's a little more than a year ago when I wrapped up my time and Jody Redorn took my place. And the idea, which was a mundane one, was that we were going to have a goodbye party for me, a hello event for her. So that would be one event in which Palestinians and Israelis would come together, which they have done for 30 years, at least, at times, events like that. I mean, they don't, it's been up and down about how often they get together, but certainly at events like that, it wasn't uncommon at all. So we chose our place in Jerusalem for the event, and we sent out our 150 invitations, and the responses started to come in from the Israelis that they were going to come, and there was just silence from the Palestinians. So at some point, a week or two before the event, maybe a little more, I get an email from Ghassan Khatib, who at that time was the spokesman for the PA, Palestinian Authority government, who said, Ethan, we'd be delighted to come say goodbye to you and be happy to meet Jody, but you're having this event in Jerusalem, and for us to come to Jerusalem from Ramallah, we need permission from the Israelis, and we're not really willing to ask for it, so we're not coming. This is something that began 2 years ago, a little less than 2 years ago, that the guys who were the VIPs, the people who were in the PA, the officials of the Palestinian Authority had not been required. They had passes, VIP passes before, but when they decided to go to the Security Council in November of 11, and ask for an increase in actually ask for membership as a state in the UN, this was one way in which the Israelis expressed their displeasure, was to take away their VIP passes. So then he said to me, Ghassan, look, why don't we have an event for you in Ramallah? I said, great, let's have an event in Ramallah. I'll come with Jody, that's a good idea. So we started to set that up, and then I got a call from him a couple days later. He said, well, we don't really want to yield Jerusalem to the Jews, so we want there to also be an event for Palestinians in Jerusalem. So I said, okay. So now we had 3 goodbye parties that we were now planning. And in fact, we had all 3, and each was kind of a tale of its own, so I want to run through them for you. As it happened, the first one to take place was the Jerusalem Palestinian event. And this was obviously in East Jerusalem in a think tank academic center called PASIA. It stands for something like Palestinian Academy for the Study of International Affairs. And it's run by a guy named Mahdi Abdul Mahdi Hadi. And Mahdi is a complicated independent thinker, gets his funding from Northern Europe, as a lot of Palestinian issues get. And he had actually tried once before to have me come talk there, and I'd agreed, and it happened that it was the very day that Gilad Shalit was released in Gaza, and I had to cancel. But it was also true that Mahdi was engaged in a kind of quiet debate with the more radical elements of young Palestinians in the Jerusalem area, in which he was trying to convince them to take part more in the events that he was doing. And they tended to believe in boycotting anything having to do with America or Israel. And so when he invited me, he wanted to sort of draw them in, and there was a kind of online debate among them about whether they should come. I was unaware of any of this at the time. In any case, we show up, Jody and I and Isabel Kirshner, who's the #2 in the Bureau, and it's a group of diplomats and Palestinian intellectuals. In Jerusalem, there are a bunch of Western diplomats. There are 7 or 8 consulates and NGOs and so forth. So those sorts of people were there. And just 2 minutes into my, sort of at this moment of my little chat, someone stands up, one of these young people whose existence I knew nothing about, and said to me, why should we listen to you? You work for a Zionist propagandist rag. More or less. Didn't speak quite so colloquially, but that was the idea. And I said, well, what do you mean? I mean, have you read the paper? And she said, I don't have to read the paper. I know what the New York Times is all about and what it stands for. And then she said to me, are you proud of your son? So you may or may not recall, but while I was the correspondent there, my second son, my younger son, chose to serve in the Israel Defense Forces for a year and a half. His decision wasn't the easiest thing that happened to me while I was there, but anyway, he was 20, it was his decision and his life, and I wasn't going to stand in his way. And he did it. And so this woman said, are you proud of him? And I said, look, you know, my relationship with my son is kind of between him and me. And she said, are you proud of your son? And I said, I'm proud of my son, at which point 6 people stood up and left. That was goodbye party number 1, goodbye party. So the second one was in Ramallah. And again, Jody and Isabel and actually Rina Castelnuovo, our really fabulous photographer in Jerusalem, we all piled into a car, drove, planning to drive through the Kalandia checkpoint, which is the easiest way to drive between Jerusalem and Ramallah. And it's a place with plenty of trouble at different times. You never know what its source is while it's happening. And as it happened, it was blocked. It was just jam-packed. We were behind 100 cars. We couldn't move. And we were, you know, due there in 10 minutes, and it was going to take us an hour. So we eventually sort of ditched the car somewhere reasonable and began to walk and hail a cab, and eventually showed up an hour late to our own party. And, you know, the hummus had that kind of brown crust thing going on. It was really depressing, and most people had left, so that was goodbye party number 2. Goodbye party number 3 was the one we had originally planned, and it was in a nice venue in West Jerusalem on King David Street, if you know Jerusalem, across from the King David, next to the YMCA. And it was really a classic contemporary Israeli event with very wonderful little snacky things, great food in Israel these days, spectacular wine, and a large crowd, but of course an entirely Israeli and foreign crowd, except for 2 Palestinians that I'm aware of. One, interestingly enough, was our stringer, fixer, correspondent, we use different names, in Gaza, a man named Faris Akram. And it's actually very unusual that the Israeli military permitted Faris to come out of Gaza and come to Israel. It was upon my request. They basically sealed the place off, as you doubtless know, and Gazans are not welcome in Israel unless there are 300 or 400 business people who do some, obviously, commerce in Israel. And if you're very, very sick and need to go to a hospital, that's another way you can get in. But just to sort of come is very hard. But the military did yield to my request. It was actually the second time they'd let him in. I argued it was for this transition and it was necessary for our work and so forth. So there's Faris standing around in this event. You know, he doesn't drink because he's Muslim, but everyone is drinking the wine. And all of these Israelis are beginning to realize that there's someone from Gaza there, and they really want to talk to him because there's no connection at all between Gaza and Israel at all anymore. I mean, it used to be, of course, a standard situation of occupation in which Israelis came and went and Palestinians came and went, but since 2007, that's not the case at all. And so you had this fascinating scene of, you know, people wearing kippot and ministers of the government with their guys with the little standing around, the security guys near them, standing around and talking to Faris and asking them as if he's a sort of exotic bird. You know, what's it like in Gaza today? And it was amazing to watch people like Dan Meridor, you know, Likud ministers who have no one to talk to who's been to Gaza or in Gaza for a long time. The second Palestinian was our West Bank guy, Khaled Abu Akr. And he actually is a Jerusalemite. You know, there are 5 kinds of Palestinians, if you don't know. There are the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, some of them sometimes called the 48 Palestinians. There are the Palestinians who are West Bankers. There are the Palestinians who are Gazans. There are the Palestinians who live abroad in the diaspora. And then there are the Jerusalemite Palestinians who are not citizens of Israel, but carry what are called blue IDs, although I don't think they're blue anymore. So Khalid is a blue ID carrier, and he was the other one who came. And one thing I want to tell you about both Faris and Khalid is that both of them lost their fathers to the Israeli security forces, the very force that my younger son decided to join. Khalid's father was jailed in 1970. He was a Fatah activist and died in prison. You know, his story, and I've never checked it, is that his father was tortured to death in prison. I'm not sure how I would check it. In any case, he has sort of martyr status in Palestine. And Faris's father was killed by a stray shell in the 08-09 three-week invasion of Gaza by the IDF. So both of these two guys with whom I spent a lot of time, my closest Palestinian collaborators, lost their fathers to the very security system that my son had joined. And the most interesting thing was that we didn't really care. It's not what it didn't drive us apart. We were joined by a lot of common beliefs. We worked closely together. We protected one another. When I'm in Gaza, I need the guy to be with me at every moment, be aware. My Arabic is pretty limited. And, he's looking around for what's going on. So we were joined by a belief in truth-seeking, in journalism, and in personal trust, all of which are increasingly lacking in this conflict. And we all three knew something else, which is that any chance of broader coexistence right now in Israel and Palestine is fading rapidly because the sides are simply turning away from one another and increasingly do not think of one another in human terms. Olivia mentioned that this was my third tour in Jerusalem. I was there in the 80s for Reuters and in the 90s for the Boston Globe. And so over these 30 years, exactly 30 years, I started in 83 in Jerusalem for Reuters, obviously in and out, but not there continuously. But I can sort of measure the arc of mutual disdain that has developed in these 3 decades. When I first got there as a reporter in 83, if you were in Gaza, you could drive to Tel Aviv for dinner without meeting a single checkpoint or a single soldier, go to the restaurant, eat, turn around, go home, go to sleep. Nothing got in your way. I, as a reporter in 83, was able to drive to the northern edge of Israel, park my car, call the UN, walk across the border, hail a cab to Sidon or Beirut. Okay? These things are unimaginable today. Saad Erekat, the chief Palestinian negotiator, who at that time in the 80s was like the, I think, chief editorial writer for Al-Quds newspaper and lives in Jericho, used to say to me, I could go to Tel Aviv for dinner, my wife and I could get in a car, we could go places. Everything has changed from those days. So these things today, if you've been to Israel, are completely unimaginable. Today, it's a series of barriers and walls and fences and checkpoints that are keeping everything, all of these sides separated in that same way. Now, obviously, there are reasons that these security barriers have been erected. In 1990, 1991, when the PLO supported Saddam Hussein and Iraq, and the Second Intifada and the terrorism that broke out and the hundreds of Israelis who were killed, I'm not saying that this is all without reason. There's plenty of blame to go around. But what I am saying is that there's an utter tragedy to this situation right now. And of course the question is, does it serve either side's interest? Does it serve Israel's interest to do it this way? I'm not going to answer the question because it's a complicated question, but it seems to me the question that at least needs to be asked. During my different stays in Israel, there were at one time tens of thousands of Palestinians who worked in Israel. I think at the height it was like 150,000 Palestinians who every day came into Israel, and the geography is tiny if you've ever been. I remember speaking to an Egyptian diplomat the first time he went to Israel, and he looks at the Jordan River, he says, "This is it? This is it?" It's like a trickle. It's like, the Hudson is sort of this massive river. Anyway, so it's tiny. But what I can tell you is, of course, it was a colonial-style relationship between the Israelis and the Palestinians, not so different from an American-Mexican relationship, if you like. But it was a very different era, and that difference is something I think is worth stopping to think about for a minute, beyond the barriers and the walls and so on. There was no Arab satellite television at the time, no Al Jazeera, no Al Arabiya, no Al Manar, the Hezbollah channel. And so what it meant is that Palestinians would watch Israeli television. They had no other choice. I mean, they could see Egyptian TV movies every now and then, but there were one or two Israeli channels which they got, and they spoke Hebrew, watched Israeli television, and had a kind of weird admiration for Israeli democracy. I remember in 1994, I believe, after the Oslo Accords, and Arafat was either on his way back or had come back, there was a poll that was done of Palestinians asking them which democracies in the world they admire the most. And ahead of the European countries in the United States came Israel, because they knew. They turned on their TV, and there's this unrelenting sort of robust debate in Israel in which officials are held to account. No one has any but particular reverence for anybody in power. And, it inspired them. I mean, I spoke at that time when I was there in those days for the Boston Globe to many Palestinians who were returning in the hope of rebuilding and building Palestine, who said, this is what we want. We don't, and I remember also that in the era when Arafat returned in 1994, in July, I think, of 94, walking in the streets of Gaza and asking people, and they said, we don't hate Israel, we just want its foot off our neck. We want to get along. I'm not saying that that's the case today, by the way, which is another element of the tragedy. The point is that in those days also, if you were a Palestinian and you worked in Israel, and your kid was getting married, you invited your coworker, your boss, your employer to the wedding in Hebron, in Ramallah, in Nablus. And that person went. So there was a sense of humanity that fed the relationship. Each understood that there were people and families and lives on the other side. And today, you just don't have that. There are almost no dialogue groups. There's almost no travel. It is illegal for Israelis by Israeli law to enter Palestinian cities. It's very hard for Palestinians to come into Israel. And so there has developed this kind of incredible mutual disdain in which the only Israelis Palestinians know are those at the end of a gun, if they're in the West Bank, or their enemy, and their invader, if they're in Gaza. And Israelis have put Palestinians out of their mind. Again, in the earlier time when I was a reporter there, in the 80s and 90s, there were Israeli reporters in Gaza quite regularly. Now they're not permitted by Israeli law to go, and it would not be very wise for them to go at this moment anyway. But the result is that there is a kind of lack of any real interest in the human nature of life in Gaza. And it's a sad thing, because Gaza is this really a kind of large welfare state, okay? It is not the most miserable place on earth, if that's what you've been told. That's not true. It is not sub-Saharan Africa, and it is remarkable in many ways because it's been taken care of by the United Nations since the day that Israel was founded by UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency. So there is 100% or virtually 100% literacy in Gaza, including among women, maybe not 100, but 90, which is way better than Egypt. There is no starvation. There are very few sort of diseases that the poorest parts of the world suffer from. So there's not that kind of misery, but there is just this incredible sense of no future, of no arc of way to move forward. It's very hard to leave Gaza. The Israelis have blocked it off. The Egyptians, of course, blocked it off, except during the period of the Muslim Brotherhood just recently. And even then, to some extent, they did. So there is a sense that, of this place that no one's paying attention to in Israel, over which it has a lot of influence. And again, I'm not saying there's no rationale for the policy toward Gaza and toward Hamas. Hamas is, after all, not exactly a Zionist organization. But again, the question I want to imply is this in Israel's interest to proceed with this policy? My time visiting Gaza tells me that only a minority of people in Gaza actually support Hamas. I would say that if you took the body politic you'd find that half of the people despise both Fatah and Hamas, and the other half are probably divided 60-40 pro Hamas, okay? I'm not saying that they don't have, but it's not huge. And you could say to yourself, and people have said this to Israel, including Tony Blair, and this is sort of the European and even the State Department view to some extent, if you allowed more commerce in Gaza, if you allowed greater economic development, the natural beneficiaries of that development would be the middle class. The middle class is the natural opponent of Hamas. And you would be effectively creating a counterforce to what's ruling in Gaza today. Wouldn't that be a good idea? And I actually have had this conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu. It was off the record, and it was several years ago. But interestingly, he basically said, I hear you, but the security guys really don't want me to do this. It's dangerous. It's risky. And because he's very much of a market kind of guy, right? That's sort of his whole world. That's how he rose in politics in Israel, as a free market advocate, and did a lot for the Israeli economy. But the idea is squeeze it, hold it tight, and eventually there'll be some kind of a rebellion, uprising, whatever, and there'll be less risk to us. So that's one theory. The other theory, of course, so there are two competing theories about what to do about Gaza. One is, as I say, the sort of Tony Blair idea, try to help the middle class, the business class, the educated class, and there are, by the way, a fair number of quite educated people in Gaza. And the counter theory, which is, my God, in the middle of this storm that we are having in the Middle East today, the last thing we should be doing is taking any chances. The rise of Islamism, the Arab awakening, the endless turmoil around us, this is the moment to hang tight and hold on to what we have, wait for the storm to pass. So I'm not sure the storm is going to pass anytime soon, and it is also true that the Arab world, which used to spend all of its time thinking about the Palestinians because it was so repressed it couldn't really talk about anything else. It was a kind of substitute talk for their own lack of freedom. Now, of course, has plenty to talk about. And the Palestinians are no longer the very first item, probably the second or third item either, on the Arabs' agenda as they debate what to do. And that feels like that kind of a good deal for the Israelis, right? Suddenly there's a little less pressure on that point. But I would say that, again, from my experience, it's an illusion to imagine that the Palestinians have been forgotten in the Arab world. I don't think so at all, and I think, in fact, the Arab world is more hostile to Israel than it has been, at least as hostile, if not more so. And there is a surprising place in the Arab heart for the Palestinian mistreatment in Israel. And I think of a story that Keith Dayton told me. Keith Dayton is a retired three-star general who, when I arrived in Jerusalem in 2008, was in charge of training the Palestinian security forces in the West Bank. He's since retired. So interesting thing about Dayton is that he is not a Middle East guy to start with. He was trained in the sort of Soviet stuff. And his first experience in the Middle East was in 2003 when President Bush asked him to lead the attempt to find the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. That didn't go too well. But Dayton told me over breakfast one day that, you know, they'd be going around the Republican Guard barracks and so forth, doing their inspection in Iraq. And inside the barracks, no attempt to show, there'd be graffiti showing the Al-Aqsa Mosque of Jerusalem, the dome being squeezed by the serpent, on the serpent written Israel. So he said to me that, you know, deep inside, hundreds of miles from Jerusalem, there is this great sense of injustice, sense of anger about what has happened. And I think that that's right. My experience traveling the Arab world tells me that it is a little bit of a myth to say they don't care, they just like to give Israel trouble about it. It's not really in their hearts. That's not my experience. So I don't think it's an issue that Israel can comfortably walk away from. Politically, we can leave internally and morally for a little later. Now look, Israel can get along very well without the Arab world. In fact, culturally and economically, that's exactly what it's doing. The most incredible development for Israel over the last 15 years is this growth of the knowledge economy, the digital economy, the sort of thing where you don't, in fact, have to trade with your neighbors. You don't have to. So Israel looks over its borders to Europe, to Asia, to the United States, and North America generally. It's today a rich country. Israel's GDP per capita is somewhere between that of Portugal and Germany, in the low 30,000s. It's got more companies on the NASDAQ than any country except for, I think it's China. Anyway, it's the second or third. It's been accepted as a member of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the 34 or 5 richest countries of the world. And if that weren't all enough, if they didn't have this whole startup nation thing going, they found gas, huge amounts of natural gas, off their northern shore. You know, the Jews used to like to tell themselves the joke that the reason it took 40 years of wandering in the desert is the Jews were looking for the one place in the Middle East without any oil or gas. Time to hang the joke up. Because they're doing fine. They're going to be, Israel's going to be an exporter of energy almost certainly in the coming 3 to 4 years. So this is sort of the paradox of Israel today, that it's never been richer, it's never been safer, its borders have never been more quiet. There is essentially no terrorism in Israel. Obviously, wrong to say none, but very, very little, less than there's been in many years. As I mentioned earlier, the food and the wine are spectacular. The cultural production, as we see next door, is stellar. That's the highest numbers of startups per capita in the world, the biggest venture capital industry in the world. But the big question of how it's going to share this narrow piece of land with 5 million Palestinians is essentially being ignored. It's been put aside. It's not something anyone is willing to deal with right now. And this brings me to this wonderful exhibition across the way here at the Neuberger Museum, The Compromised Land, because I'm familiar with the work of many of the artists in this show. And it's just a fabulous show. It really does represent very well what's going on right now in contemporary Israel. Many of the artists, perhaps most, were born after '67. They're relatively young. It's very high tech, which is quite Israeli. I don't think there's a painting across the way. It's all video and photography. And, you know, you have these deep themes of kind of rooting and uprooting and land and dispossession, all of which are playing through in these works across the way very powerfully. The first time I saw Adi Ness's, he's got these 2 photographs in there, part of his soldier series. So you sort of walk in, big picture of a bunch of soldiers sitting at kind of utilitarian tables with kind of bowls and the usual military looking, they're drinking, they're laughing, they're pouring stuff. And it looks sort of normal, and you wait, you spend another 10 seconds looking, and you say, yeah, there's something a little strange about this. First of all, they're all incredibly good looking. There's something sort of hypersexual going on in this particular picture, and they're draped over each other a little too casually, and you kind of suddenly see that it's also, you know, evocative of a certain iconic meal with 12 guys sitting there like that. And he didn't call it this, he calls it Untitled, but many have referred to this photograph as the Last Supper. And, you know, it's this sort of homoerotic challenge to the Israeli machismo, the Christian message of looming betrayal and death. All of these things are very subtle and I think brilliant challenges to kind of the Israeli zeitgeist. And it's done very cunningly and really worth a look. And, you know, this is true of Barry Friedlander as well. He has these high-tech compositions of beautiful, massive photographs. So you have these Israeli artists today who are really undergoing a flowering. The Israeli artistic scene, as is the movie scene, which is another talk we will have another day. Incredible, incredible outpouring of high-level art in Israel today. And what's there, you know, these guys have been in MoMA and PS1 and in Berlin and everywhere. It's, you know, it's, you're lucky to have them grouped together this way in one place. But what's also interesting is that they're not really spending time on kind of the specifics of what happened this year or last year. You know, they don't devote a huge amount of attention to what the Israelis call hamatzav, the situation, the conflict per se. It's sort of larger. If you look at Sigalit Landau, really Israel's probably most prominent video artist, you have this thing where she's got this barbed wire, certainly partly the symbol of security things, you know, at various army bases and in walls and barriers and so forth, using it like a hula hoop across her naked body as a form of sort of self-mutilation, as a statement of what is this self-inflicted wound that's going on. And, you know, obviously a reflection on the Palestinian situation, but also something larger, it seems to me, about masochism and the erotic. There's an amazing piece of hers in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, also on the floor, like one of hers is here. This one here, I think, is Azkalan, because Aza is the Hebrew for Gaza. So it's, anyway, that's another piece in there. So the one in the Israel Museum shows her, again, naked amid hundreds of watermelons, all strung together, kind of unspooling across the Dead Sea. You know, really quite amazing stuff. And then you have Yael Barton, who, in this show, you have her Trembling Time, which shows you sort of standing on an overpass in a Tel Aviv highway on the day of Memorial Day in Israel, where you memorialize the dead soldiers killed in all the wars. And you have the drivers start to stand, and, you know, their minds are certainly caught between whatever individual issues happening and some sense of collective identity, because everyone is supposed to stand at attention for those 2 minutes in Israel, and it's a remarkable sight to see. Some of it in here video are in slow motion, and some of it's sort of manipulated, so the vehicles vanish and pull along ghosts. And, you know, it forces you to ask yourself, what is this ritual? And you have, of course, the wall in some of these works. You have the land, right? You have Boggy Man, this piece by Rackman, where he's sort of in a kind of quicksand, disappearing. Comment, obviously, on the land's obsession and its ability to hold on to Israelis in perhaps an unseemly way. And, you know, you have Adi Ness, not just his Last Supper. You have the four guys taking a pee, 4 soldiers taking a pee viewed from behind on the land, and, you know, very, very interesting. So, but these are, as I say, fairly large themes, and what I think what speaks to their maturity as art is that they're not about that specific moment. And one of I've sort of asked art historians, you know, why there isn't more about what's going on. And an explanation I heard that I kind of like is that so much of what happened in the last 10 or 15 years has been sort of sequels to earlier events, the Second Intifada, the Second Lebanon War, the Second Gulf War, and that there was a kind of second child syndrome, that, you know, it's just not that powerful a set of events to reflect on. But I also think that, you know, part of what's happened is that these events in the Israel-Palestine arena have become kind of stuck. There is a sort of repetitive nature to it. Certainly, I believe that I could take stories that I wrote for Reuters in the mid-'80s and put them in the newspaper and you wouldn't notice. That's my sense. I mean, not all of them. I'd have to change a couple names, but it's amazing how similar the events just keep repeating themselves. And for me, as a reporter over there, my sense was that one impact or one effect of that stuck nature of the conflict was that there was a growing focus on the narrator, on the narration, on the storyteller, meaning people like me. So there was so much emphasis on how the story was being told and what language you were using and whose perspective you were offering that it was quite impressive and difficult. You know, you had to work hard to stay focused on your job because there was so much noise around it. When I was over there between 08 and 12, sometimes I would come back a couple of times a year, and I mean, obviously to visit, but also one of the things I would do was give talks. And one time before I left, an Israeli friend of mine said, "So you're going back to give a speech, whom are you talking to?" And I said, "You know, I talk to different groups. I talk to community groups. I talk to undergraduates, college students. I talk to Jewish groups." He sort of grabs me by the collar and he says, "You tell those undergraduate college students that Israel is not a racist, fascist, apartheid state." I said, "Okay, I promise I will. And what do you want me to tell the Jews?" He said, "Tell the Jews it is." And I tell you that because, you know, it's a good story and it's a true story, but also it's about the sort of relative nature of this narrative of truth. You know, there are so many ways you could tell this story over there, and it's because it's stuck. They're all getting plenty of airing, and you know and because it's so long, you can gather all the evidence you want from your perspective. And it's what has happened is it's kind of calcified into this black and white dynamic where each side is completely convinced that it has everything it needs to know about the situation. The other side is just wrong. And I can't tell you how strong a feeling that is, that black and white phenomenon. And my feeling is that my job as correspondent at the Times there, given how well the story has been told so many times by my predecessors and by many other people, is to try to get beyond the black and white and to traffic somehow in gray. And I can tell you that in a black and white world, when you traffic in gray, it's a great way to get everybody to hate you, and that I did pretty well at, I have to tell you. Now, when you're a foreign correspondent, it doesn't matter where you are, but when you're abroad and far away from your readers at home, you want to tell them two contradictory things. On the one hand, you want to say to people, the people here that I'm reporting on, you know, they may look different from you and dress different than you. They may be a different religion and speak a different language, but they love their children. They enjoy ice cream. They eat 3 meals a day. They care about the future. In short, these are people like you and me. You must grasp their humanity if you're to understand what's going on over here. So that's one task that you very much feel is important when you're abroad. The second task, though, is to sort of deliver the opposite message, which is to say, dear reader, if you think that by knowing that the people here are people, that they love their children, that they eat ice cream, that they like action movies, that they sort of, in many ways, remind you of yourself, that that's all you need to know, oh no, my dear friend, that is completely false. There are so many things that you need to understand, cultural and religious assumptions that are going on in this place, that if you don't make an effort to understand, you will never get what's going on. So these people are very different from you and me. And it's this, the correspondent who's doing his or her job is sort of toggling between these two impulses to get these messages across because they are both true and both simultaneously true. So my sense was that my job was to try to get you, if you're an avid follower of events, to question the assumptions that you have about the conflict. So that if you're somebody who is convinced that no matter what Israel does, a Jewish country in the Middle East under no circumstances will be accepted. So I want to introduce you to characters, to events, to moments, to narrative lines that will force you at least stir you to ask yourself whether is that the whole story? Or, by contrast, if you're someone who says, the whole problem in the Middle East is that the Israelis are aggressors, and they've built these settlements, and they've taken over land that doesn't belong to them, and if only they gave it back, everything would be fine in that part of the world, then again, I want to introduce you to moments and historical thoughts and characters that are going to ask, at least stir you to ask, well, maybe that's not the whole story either. The thing that's amazing, too, is how each side believes it gets bad press, right? Each side, I mean, from the Palestinian perspective, the New York Times, as I mentioned earlier, is viewed as kind of an arm of the Zionist Organization of America. And from the Jewish community, organized Jewish community perspective, it's often seen as sort of an apologist for the Palestinians, that they can do no wrong. You never come down hard on them. Everything is written in a way that makes their side of the story look accurate. And what I try to tell audiences is that journalism, especially Jewish audiences who feel that Israel gets a bad rap, is to say to them, it's not Israel that gets a bad rap, it's that everybody gets a bad rap in journalism. Journalism is about difficulty, it's about trouble, it's about tension. It was when they say, why don't you write about the good things going on in Israel? Because we don't write about the good things going on pretty much anywhere. That's not what we do. That's not what journalism is about. So we don't, you don't read about the million people who went to work and came home and had dinner with their family in New York. You read about the guy who got shot in the head and thrown into the East River. That's what journalism is. And it's not just in Israel. Our correspondents in India and Brazil and China are viewed as anti-Indian, anti-Brazilian, anti-Chinese by the authorities in all those countries, which have not hesitated to throw out many of our correspondents. And the Israelis, believe me, are tempted, but so far their laws don't allow them. I would also say that it's not unique to journalism, what I'm telling you. I think it's sort of how we as human beings tell our stories to ourselves, that we tend to focus on the negative. It's part of what animates us. I mean, if you go to Italy and have a wonderful week looking at art and eating great food, and then you get mugged and robbed, that's the week you got mugged and robbed, not the week you saw the Pietà. I just think the journalism has not made this up. It's just kind of reflecting. It's not smart enough to come up with some new agenda. It's just reflecting how we talk to ourselves about ourselves. All the foreign correspondents for the Times have more than one story to tell, right? Our correspondent in Rome is expected also to cover Spain and Portugal. Our correspondent in Rio also covers Argentina. And these are not societies all in love with one another, okay? The Brazilian-Argentine story is complicated. The story of many neighbors is complicated. But in Jerusalem, you face just competing narratives, black and white, the opposite. Every single event that occurs, every single place, has the kind of opposite label by the other side in this conflict. So, whether, that thing that is working its way along the West Bank and somewhat inside it, the Palestinians call it a wall because that sounds aggressive. The Israelis call it a fence because that sounds neighborly. And the New York Times calls it a barrier because we hope it doesn't sound like anything. That sort of slightly raised holy spot in the center of Old Jerusalem, it's the Temple Mount to the Jews, it's the Haram al-Sharif, or noble sanctuary, to Muslims. And so the question is, when you are writing about it, in my situation, what do you call it? And so you end up sort of saying what they call, and what is terrorism? When is something a terrorist act? The Times used to almost never use the word terrorism until September 11th, and then it was terrorist this, terrorist that, right? Certainly with regard to al-Qaeda. But in the Israel-Palestine conflict, we are still very, very skittish about using it. We might call it a terrorist act, but we don't, especially on the moment that it happens, you don't necessarily know what happened. If someone has killed a settler in his home or his children, could it be a disgruntled employee? nobody really knows at the moment. And that's, of course, when passions are running highest, and when you don't use the word terrorism, that's when everybody gets angry at you. And I think that part of the problem is about this black-white divide is that people don't really sympathize all that much with the idea of seeking neutrality. They really want their story told. One time, I gave a talk in a synagogue in Westchester here. It was an Orthodox synagogue. And this is some years ago when we were just working on the wall fence barrier thing, because we hadn't come to any conclusion, but more or less at that point we had. This must be 8 years ago. And so I laid it out, wall, fence, barrier, okay, you've heard it. And then afterwards, a lady came up to me and asked me a question, and in my answer, I started using the word barrier. And she pokes me in the chest and says, fence. You're talking to a fence person now, right? So what she wanted was talk in my terms, which is exactly not what I see my job as. There's a phrase that a friend of mine used about what it is that I try to do, and I really like it, so I'm going to tell it to you. He said, it's provocative neutrality. And my feeling is we should replace all the news that's fit to print with provocatively neutral. And if we're doing our job right, it should be a way to step back out of your own emotional and political needs and see something about something larger, and to develop some level of neutral ground to talk about the story we're involved in. My concern about what's going on right now, and I'll get to the negotiations in a minute before I finish, is that both Palestinians and Israelis are essentially living with the belief, you might call an illusion, that time is on their side. The Israelis, they look at the success of what they've done for the last, well, I guess 135 years, basically since the 1880s when the Zionist movement began to settle Palestine. And they see that you put one foot in front of the other, you build, you defend, you move along, and that's what gets us where we need to go. And you know what? All that other talk, it's never really produced all that much. So let's just keep going. Let's not pay any attention, and we're going to get there. And the Palestinians, on the other hand, look around and they say, I mean, this can't be. These guys, they've come in from abroad, they've taken our land. No one is going to accept this. The world will come to our aid. Look what's happening in the region. There is a movement, an uprising. We'll just hold fast to our beliefs. If there is a God, if there's justice, if truth exists in the world, this will not last. And I can't tell you how many Arabs and Palestinians believe that Israel will not last, that it can't last, which is not my impression at all, by the way. So you have this sense of each side living with a kind of hardened, thickened, calcified illusion of what's going to be the future. And it's also true that each national movement has worked very hard from the beginning to prevent a two-state solution. I mean, we don't have to say that they've worked exactly equally hard. We can get to that, but they've certainly worked very hard, both of them. Palestinians have hundreds of thousands of refugees in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon. And they are in refugee camps, and they have keys in some cases, deeds in other cases, to homes that no longer exist from the 1940s. And they're told, hold on to those, don't move, you're going home. And home, they don't mean the new Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, if we get to that. They mean Jaffa, they mean Ashkelon, they mean the places that their grandparents left, or great-grandparents. There's probably only 8 or 10% of the refugees who left who are still alive, but their descendants are holding tight, and they are encouraged to hold tight. And every poll of Palestinians says the right of return is the most important thing. So that's the Palestinians. The Israelis, on the other hand, have, from the very moment the '67 war ended, built settlements in the West Bank. From the very moment. Within seconds of that war ending, the first settlers went to Gush Etzion. Now, of course, life's complicated. Gush Etzion had been a Jewish community before the war. So they thought they had a natural right to return to it. But whatever the circumstances in all of these places, there are now 500, nearly 600,000 Jews living over what's used to be called the Green Line, right? Living to the east of the temporary borders that were founded after the 48 war. And I don't see any government in Israel being willing to move them from their homes. And this is a society dedicated to the idea of home, dedicated to the idea of building. If the Zionist movement means anything, it means you build. You don't take people away from homes. Now, yes, in Sinai, some people were moved. In Gaza, 9,000 people were moved. But the point is that at the moment, the sense is that those were bad ideas, failures that didn't work. We didn't get what we were supposed to get. The people were mistreated. Damn if we're going to let that happen again. And I can't see, certainly this government, run by Prime Minister Netanyahu, moving anything like the number of people we're talking about. And even the most optimistic scenarios, if you go online and look at how can we do this, the most optimistic scenario means 80 to 90,000 people being moved. Look, I'd be happy to come back in a year or two and you tell me I was wrong, but I just can't see either side making the kind of tough decisions needed to really move this process along. Now, we have, for the past 3 months, for the first time since 2008, actually had Palestinians and Israelis negotiating quietly with the American help, obviously. So this is an amazing development. In the entire 4+ years that I was there were many attempts through Jordan, through this, through that. Nothing lasted. Everything leaked. Everything fell apart. For these 3 months, there have been essentially no leaks. And they're continuing to negotiate, whatever that means. So I don't know exactly what's going on. I did, a few weeks ago, attend a dinner in honor of Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, and the key players were there. Tzipi Livni wasn't there, but Saeb Erekat was there on the Palestinian side. Martin Indyk was there, the American agent for these negotiations, and it was very hard to take the temperature of what's going on. I did say to Saeb Erekat, I know you can't tell me what's going on, but how's it going? And so he said to me, and I've known this guy a long time, more than 20 years, and he's somewhere between cynical and skeptical about the Israeli endeavors and plans. And he said to me with great energy, I was born for this. This is why my parents got me an education. This is why I'm on this earth, to make this deal work. And I thought, wow, if Saeb Erekat is talking like that, maybe something is going on under this cone of silence that I know that I can't penetrate at the moment. On the other hand, someone else who I also trust and who knows a lot about these negotiations said to me, it's Groundhog Day all over again. So there are many reasons to believe that these talks will fail, all right? The Israelis beyond the Green Line that I just mentioned, the Palestinian divisions between Hamas in Gaza and Fatah in the West Bank. Both societies are moving away, as I tried to lay out earlier in my talk, away from a sense of humanity of the other side. The Palestinians' unwillingness to even consider giving up a right of return, and the Israelis' unwillingness to think about moving settlers. And if you look at the paper today, or maybe it'll be in tomorrow's paper, I saw it online before I came, the Israeli cabinet is trying to ban the negotiations from discussing Jerusalem. Tzipi Livni is trying to stop that, but there is clearly a majority in this government to do that. So we'll never share Jerusalem, is this cabinet's feeling, and it's hard to imagine a deal going through without that. So I'll try to leave you on one little note of optimism, which is, why might a deal be able to be struck? First of all, I would say that what's happening in the rest of the region is surprisingly helpful to a Palestinian-Israeli deal. Helpful is a horrible thing to say about all the death and destruction, so please take it with a grain of salt. But what I mean to say is that Israel's military and security situation has in some ways never been better. Syria, which was the kind of frontline anti-Israel state, is essentially tearing its own heart out. Egypt has been now, after a period of Muslim Brotherhood, been taken over by the military, which has relations with the Israeli military and with the Americans. And there is just a sense that Israel's self-image as the reliable partner in the region is really a useful card for it to play right now. And Hamas is on the ropes. So from Mahmoud Abbas's perspective, you know, this isn't a bad time to try to impose the Fatah worldview. If they can get a deal, if the Israelis will come up with something that they can trade, then he can go to his people and say, let's have an election. And, you know, I'm not giving this much of a chance of happening, but I want to lay out why, in some odd set of circumstances, it could happen. I do think that it's a more propitious moment for those reasons than it's been in many years. On the other side, I do think that all of the endless failures of previous attempts harden everyone's heart and make it very hard to come forward with a deal. There's one more point about why it might be a moment, and that is the issue of Iran. From Israel's perspective, the only thing out there that is truly an existential threat, it is certainly not Palestine, is an Iran with nuclear weapons capacity, which is why this is sort of the only thing that Netanyahu goes to sleep thinking about and gets up thinking about. And I don't know, but I would imagine that Secretary Kerry and President Obama have said to him, hey, this issue matters to us too, but we need something to happen on this other issue. We believe American interests will be served by a deal in Israel-Palestine. We believe that Jewish democracy will be served. We believe everything that we stand for will be helped if you can come to terms with this problem. And then it'll be a lot easier to count on us when there's an Iran question, an Iran nuclear question ahead of us. Now, this has taken a weird detour with Rouhani seeming to be far more moderate than any Iranian until now, and we'll see where that goes. There's this weird new thing of Israel and the Arab Gulf states being very skeptical about Iran compared with how Americans and the Europeans view them. But, you know, Shimon Peres, the president of Israel, said that history is like a galloping horse, and the job of leaders is to jump on that horse as it goes past their window. And the Americans say, okay, we're going to bring that horse to your damn window, and we're expecting you to jump. And, you know, I don't know if they're jumping. I know they're in a room talking, and we can all hope, because it's the only way forward that makes any sense to me. But I leave you with a sense of ambivalence, certainly, about whether this is going to go anywhere, and I'm happy now to take your questions. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.